Welcome to today's episode of the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward Friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of a 5-part series called Leading Yourself and Others Through Uncertain Times. Today we are talking about understanding the impact that these uncertain times will have on you and the people that you will be leading. Whether that be in the workplace or throughout the rest of your life. You ready? Let's do it. This podcast is brought to you by Map It Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/Map It Forward to find out how you can become a member today. Understanding the impact that these uncertain times ahead, which are not going to be with us just a couple of months. I believe that we are in this for at least a few years. But understanding the impact that will have is fundamental to navigating this scenario well. If we look back to a crisis that happened before the pandemic, the 2008 global financial crisis, it took many years, not only for that crisis to be over, but for people to recover. And understanding the impact that you are exposed to in this scenario will better help you prepare and respond once those 5 things that we spoke about in the previous episode really start to unfold. It is important to start the process of knowing the impact that they're likely to have on you, for you to spend some time, as I mentioned in the last episode, understanding what each of these things mean. So not just saying, oh, we're experiencing inflation. Have an understanding of what the inflation in the country that you live in is. Have an understanding of what other scenarios are happening with the economy. Don't just use one source for your information, and preferably take everything that you read and understand with a grain of salt. For example, the way that governments report inflation now is very different to the way that they used to report it, and the calculations that are done today remove a certain number of things from the discussion, which they didn't used to remove before. And so therefore, the inflation numbers are a little, let's say, finessed compared to how they used to be. So, as we said, understanding the scenario is important and a fundamental building block for you to start really being able to understand the impact that it will have on your business. I suspect if you're a business that is located in Europe, you are more likely to be impacted and more quickly impacted by what's happening geopolitically between Russia and Ukraine. You are also more likely to be impacted by what's happening economically because Europe is, for all intents and purposes, in a recession. And because of those things happening more quickly in Europe than they are in, let's say, Australia or in the United States, which are both very close to being on the brink of recessions themselves, understanding the impact and the more immediate impact on you and on your business and the people that you lead will be an advantage when things do start to accelerate. What do I mean by the impact that they will have on you and on your business and the people that you lead? It will be important for you as a business to understand what your balance sheet looks like and what your profit and loss statements or your income statements are telling you about the health of your business. If you don't understand what those things are, again, we refer back to get informed and understand the situation. Learn what a balance sheet is. learn what an income statement is and what insight they give you about your business. How much credit do you have access to if you run out of money in the bank, cash on hand? Do you have access to anything? And if you don't, what's your runway? And what I mean by runway, how many months of operation do you have access to money-wise to stay open? When will you run into trouble? It is really, really important for you to have access to that information as quickly as possible. A lot of you out there might be thinking, but Lee, my business is doing great. I don't understand why you think this would become a problem. And I'm really happy to hear how many people are doing really great. And I say great in inverted commas, because we have a tendency in our industry to think that simply because we're making lots of sales and we've got lots of money coming into the business, that it means that we're doing great. But most of the time, client after client after client, after listener of this podcast, after listener of this podcast, when I get into conversations with people, they have little insight into how much actual money they are profiting net. That's after all their expenses. People tend to look at the money in their bank account and say, well, I've got enough to cover my bills. Right, but for how long? And what big bills do you have coming that you haven't started accounting for? Your profit and loss statement will give you really great insight into these wisdoms. And this is what I spend a lot of time consulting with businesses on, helping them to learn how to read these things so that when they have questions, they know exactly where to go. Or when there's a crisis, they know exactly what part of their income statement to go to in order to cut costs. These things are really important. We spoke in the last episode about the impact of supply chains. Are you across what's happening with coffee producers? Do you know that the same as all agricultural commodities all over the world, coffee is being greatly impacted by the war in Ukraine because of fertilizers and other inputs that coffee producers need to make coffee a successful endeavor. Because of the very expensive prices that are now put onto many of the inputs that go into producing coffee. Our inputs are things like anything that a coffee producer needs to help input into the process of producing coffee. Because those things are getting more expensive, they're having to make very important decisions about whether they buy them or whether they have to make do without. Using fertilizers increases the yield of a harvest. That means that when they use fertilizers, they get more of an output. They end up with more coffee, essentially, and better quality coffee or healthier coffee, cherries. Now, if they go without the fertilizer, they go with a drop or a reduction in the supply of coffee to the rest of the supply chain. If they have less coffee to sell with the same number of people that are wanting the coffee, that means the price goes up. So it continues to feed into the inflation story. It's important for you to understand that impact to you and to the community that you're in. It may be time for you guys to come together if you're a coffee roasting business and purchase as a group to increase your buying power. Another thing, when we're talking about the impact and we're talking about leading yourself and others, there is a serious mental health issue being experienced by a lot of the workforce and a lot of the business owners in our industry. What will be the likely impact of that moving forward as more and more stress enters the scenario? I get feedback sometimes from people that says that this is a negative podcast. Folks, talking about this stuff is uncomfortable. I 100% acknowledge that. But it is not negative. It is the polar opposite of negative. By preparing you and preparing all of us, we benefit. It means we're better able to make decisions. And that's my intention behind having these conversations. When you go to your teams and have proactive conversations about what's happening, they may also think that you are being negative. Help them understand that you want them to know that being proactive may be uncomfortable. Having conversations about some very challenging decisions that need to come into the future about staffing and about pricing and about supply and opening hours and things like that. It's uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it negative. And we're in an industry that tends to shy away from uncomfortable because we want to just feel happy all the time. There's a lot that's broken about our industry. And unfortunately, we've been kicking the can down the road. Not everyone. A lot of people in our industry have been ignoring a lot of the things that have happened over the past, let's say, 10 years at least, that have led us to a lot of these problems. If you're a long-time listener of this podcast, the term kicking the can down the road is something you are probably sick of hearing me talk about, because during the pandemic, what we started to see was the very beginnings of this process that we are now in, which is the road ending for people who had kicked the can down the road. And unfortunately, what I think is going to happen is a continuation of businesses going out of business that haven't prepared their business for the economic and supply chain issues that will continue to unfold in the coming years. I hope this has continued your learning about leading yourself and others in uncertain times. I wish that we could be embarking on an era of prosperity after what was a very challenging pandemic for everyone. Whether you did well or not during the pandemic, it was difficult for everybody having to adapt. Unfortunately, I feel the times that are coming are here to challenge us again, and perhaps to a greater degree. Being prepared is one way that I believe we can continue along this journey of business and employment in the coffee industry, and perhaps thrive while working very hard to duck and weave the obstacles that keep flying at our heads. And I suspect there will be many. In the next episode, we're going to talk specifically about inflation and the economy and how to talk to your teams about those kinds of subjects, and some resources that I found useful in learning about these kinds of things. Please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing wherever you are consuming this podcast. I'd really love it. It really does help the podcast grow. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.